we do observe near the red purple line stations that higher income households, after the station opens, have an increase in their move out rate that is larger than the increase in move out rate among lower income households. And for households earning above 150% of area median income, that increased move out rate can be 3 percentage points. So about double of the station effect we're seeing at the low income levels. One question is why? What might be going on? A few possibilities. One, our income categories, and this may not be true of the greater than 150% of AMI, but one thing to remember, greater than 150% of AMI, and I'm abbreviating, that's area median income, that would be about ballpark $75,000 per year, would be about 150% of area median income in Los Angeles County. So $75,000, maybe $80,000 is the low end of that range. One possibility in an area where housing is as expensive as it is in Los Angeles, even that greater than 150% of area median income category may be capturing households that may be feeling some real housing cost pressure. And definitely in the 80 to 150% of area median income category, those would be persons who are basically making $50,000 to $80,000 a year. Those definitely could be households that really are experiencing some housing cost pressure. So first reason, our income categories may not have been fine-grained enough. Secondly, in the higher income category, and we did try in later analyses some more fine-grained analyses, once we get above about 300% of area median income, our sample sizes in some of these station areas does get low. And so there may be some statistical artifact there. Thirdly, there does seem to be a pattern around the red-purple line that after stations open, kind of at all income levels, persons increase their move-out rate. And that may mean that the neighborhood is changing in a way that either is more attractive to new residents moving in, or less attractive to longtime residents, or some combination of both. And it's hard for us to pick that apart. One thing I would caution, I would say don't interpret a higher increase in move-out rate among the high income as something that is counter to displacement. We are picking up increases in move-out rates among low-income households, and that could be a real signal that there is some increased displacement risk. And then the other thing is that one possible gentrification signal might mean that everyone at all income levels is moving out, particularly if the neighborhood is somehow changing in a way that is accommodating new in-movers. It's hard for us to get granular with this. All I can give you is hypotheses, but that would be my main explanation. So you don't want to read too much into those differences by income, is what I would say.
Thanks. On a personal note, do you think it has something to do with sort of flight? People don't want to be near an accessible place when they have more income?
We've discussed this a little bit in my research group. So the question of whether or not what we're seeing at along the red-purple lines, is it associated with people at all income levels moving out because they don't want to live in a rail station area? Very hard for us to understand the motives of why people might be moving out. These data, all we can do is observe a move. So I just don't know. There's an older literature that does suggest that some persons, particularly of higher income, may not want to live near a rail station because it might be associated with disamenities. I am a little skeptical of that. I think that newer rail stations are more often bring what are perceived as what you might as what persons kind of middle income categories might prefer as amenities. So as a scientist, my best answer is we can't quite tell from these data. Instinctively, if I had to guess, I would more wonder whether or not we're increasing housing supply sufficiently. The red-purple line really improves access into downtown. It is really, I think, quite
Mm-hmm.
an access and accessibility amenity. And while the red purple line stations have seen a lot of new apartment construction, I think it's a very open question whether there has been enough apartment supply increase to meet demand. And if not, you might expect that there might be persons who are literally outbidding existing residents at all income levels for apartments. So given what we know about Los Angeles, and Los Angeles has really had a problem building sufficient housing supply to meet demand kind of across all income levels going back decades. I think it might be more sensible to wonder, even along the red purple line, are we building enough to meet new demand? And we may not be.
I wondered if by definition, the success of a transit hub or a transit station is inevitable gentrification, right? I mean, that would be a kind of a definition of success, I would perhaps. And then I wondered how we sort of could, looking at the fact that these stations go in typically in low income areas, right? And going back to my past experience working in condemnation, part of the requirements of condemnation are that you pick the best place to put it, and one of them has to do with cost, right? So it's a lot harder to condemn in the middle of Beverly Hills than it is to condemn adjacent to Frogtown, say. So how do we deal with that? Is it a more fundamental question of, where our values are?
So one question that comes up is gentrification in some way inherent with rail transit or with transportation improvements generally? So I think our old thinking was yes. And I want to caution against that. I think in transportation, when we went in, we think we're improving access. And with rail transit, we think that improvement in access may trigger a whole host of synergistic neighborhood improvements. So we'd think, hey, we're making your neighborhood better, mission accomplished, almost kind of thinking. I think we really need to pause to realize that we were not effectively asking the question of, for whom are we planning? We were kind of bringing a upper middle income, quite possibly often white framing to that question of what does it mean to make a neighborhood better? And particularly, these may have been neighborhoods that may have been facing decades of underinvestment. All of a sudden, they receive some investment, but the investment is triggering a process of improvement that is not serving the needs of the longtime residents, but the needs of a group of people who may be moving in. So this instinct that we have in transportation, that's a little bit of, hey, we made your neighborhood better, apartment rents went up, that's a sign of how much better we made it. So, hey, you're welcome, almost, from the transportation planner. We need to really begin to disabuse ourselves of that idea in transportation and realize that transportation has a real obligation to redress what have been patterns of decades of disinvestment, and how do we do that? And part of that bears on this question of how do we take account of kind of power imbalances when we plan? Rail systems, particularly light rail, may in some sense be sited in locations where you can find low-cost, pre-existing right-of-way with land that is lower cost. For example, around old abandoned freight rail lines, that's not uncommon. And those may be in neighborhoods that have lower rents and have been disinvested in for decades. So there's a planning process, right? The old nostrum is you don't put your big rail system through the heart of Beverly Hills. In fact, as it turns out, Beverly Hills would rather not have the rail system. They've been telling planners. And I think there is a real power imbalance. If you think about which communities can leverage and obtain particular resources and which cannot. If you follow that pattern, you may be building to kind of reinforce amenities for communities that have always been advantaged. And I do think that there's a real discussion that we have to bring to bear in transportation about how do we tilt those scales. In Los Angeles, for example, this literally would involve somehow increasing the weight in planning that we might give to communities in Crenshaw and Leimert Park in South Los Angeles. And relatively speaking, how do we then downweight the weight that has often been given to communities in West Los Angeles? And that's a difficult discussion, but I think it needs to start by recognizing that those communities currently don't have equal voice. And maybe the question is, how do we get to a place where there is more equal voice? That logic that, if you're having to condemn properties, so take properties by eminent domain, you want to find kind of the lowest cost option. That's a great example of something that a priori might seem to make a lot of sense to a lot of people. Hey, let's build this at low cost. That has really serious equity issues. That's a built-in tension that basically says if you need to take properties, take them from low-income neighborhoods. And a taking is never pleasant. Even when you're getting reimbursed some estimate of market value. So all of a sudden, a huge question arises. Well, why? Why would we be taking only from the lowest income neighborhoods? And then that even builds in kind of routing decisions that may indeed contain this process of, oh, we took your properties, we brought this into your neighborhood, and maybe it's a trigger to build a lot of amenities for people who, hey, never lived in the neighborhood beforehand. It's one of the things we really need to examine in our processes. It's something that if you start from an efficiency perspective, how can we condemn properties at lowest cost seems to make sense. There's probably some economics course somewhere that said, hey, this is a great idea, but we need to really examine the equity properties of that and really come to grips with how that reinforces structural power imbalances that have followed patterns of ethnicity, race, and even racism for decades and longer. And so this is part and parcel of where we're at in the United States. We need to stop unthinkingly accepting these kinds of practices. And that kind of lowest cost condemnation practice would be part of it. It may cost more, but I think that we're getting to the point where we have to think of that as building in equity objectives that are absolutely essential.